Correspondent. I am delighted to welcome our keynote speaker. He is someone who's been through a presidential transition before and has experience in both the public and private sectors. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Peter Orszag. He is the former director of the Office of Management and Budget and current vice chairman and managing director at Lazard. Here to moderate the conversation is the Atlantic's national correspondent, James Fallows. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to Peter Orszag for being here. Peter, you know as much as anybody now in the prime of life about what it takes to run a government, to manage its finances, to have the interaction between the financial economy, the governmental economy, the real economy. Tell us what you think just happened politically.
The United States just succeeded in making the Brexit vote, by comparison, look eminently reasonable. There's not much more to say other than obviously a big shock to a lot of pundits and pollsters. I think it does raise really important questions about the polling industry itself, which probably should be taken by its roots, ripped up and shredded. And by the way, just on that, just because it's the kind of thing that has broader consequences than just completely missing an electoral outcome. The response rate on polls today is well under 10%. It's
Wow.
6 or 7% of people respond, and that's a problem not only for polling. By the way, the people who do answer the phone, they try to adjust, but the people who answer, a 30-year-old who answers a hardline today is not a normal 30-year-old. And there's just no way you can adjust for that. And the same problem is affecting our official statistics. Yeah. So a lot of the numbers that you read about in income and poverty and what have you are based on government surveyors calling up households and saying, how much money did you receive in food stamps and Medicaid, blah, 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 blah. And the response rates there are plummeting. And so we're imputing more and more of what you read about as the official numbers, which means we're making them up. And so there's a broader set of consequences there. But coming back to the politics, obviously a big shock, and we are going to be on a significantly different direction for the next 4 years than what was, at least I was anticipating.
And I'll ask you more about that direction in a moment, but you're now in the New York financial world. You previously were in the DC political world. Was the New York financial world any less surprised by this outcome than the DC-based political world was? No.
It was a big surprise to everyone involved, apparently also including the Trump transition team.
Well, that's the next thing I wanted to ask you. You've been through transitions. I was through a transition eons ago when the Carter administration came to town. And give the audience a little bit of what are the signs of a real transition that's being done seriously, and how would you contrast them with what you've seen in the last week?
So I should first just say, in terms of what we've seen, it's a little bit challenging because obviously I'm not on the Trump transition team, so you don't know the reality as opposed to the snippets that come out. But just to give some sense of this, a well-functioning transition ramps up substantially ahead of the actual election. That's always a little bit dicey because one doesn't want to be presumptuous, but it is necessary to get the ball rolling. And by the time of the election, you are in full swing mode on two big imperatives. One is who is going to be in your administration? And that's not only a difficulty with regard to canvassing the potential people coming off of the campaign and other supporters and outside friendly people and what have you, but also the background checks and the vetting, which takes a substantial amount of time to get teams together. And we're not just talking about the cabinet, which may be the most obvious choices, but thousands of people on down below, at the cabinet and sub-cabinet levels. So that's one big activity, the personnel front. The other front is every campaign overpromises. You've got 14, 20, 50 top priorities, because on a campaign you'll say, my top priority is X, and then my top priority is Y. And so in the immediate situation, we've got building the wall, immigration reform, tax reform, healthcare reform, big infrastructure. The list goes on and on and on and on, ripping up the deal with Iran, et cetera. I mean, it goes on and on. And even in the most auspicious settings, which I'm using the word auspicious carefully here, from your narrow political perspective of having a cooperative Congress, there's no way you can get more than, say, 2 or 3 big things done. Colin Powell likened the early part of an administration to a tractor pull. I don't know if you've ever seen these, but there's a wedge, sled behind the tractor, and the tractor starts, and the mud's flying, and it's dramatic, and the tractor starts accelerating, and then the weight settles behind it, and the tractor stops, which is basically a new administration. And so you've got to take advantage of that early period, and you've got to prioritize all of these promises that have been made. And that's also very challenging. So a transition is, it might seem like it's, just a nice pre-government period in which you can celebrate your victory, but it's actually among the most stressful and the hardest periods of time, even things that don't get noticed. So in my job, for example, my old job, there is the new administration has to come out with a budget. It's usually a high-level budget, but still a budget by early February. So you don't have time to wait until January, that mid to late January to basically have that in place. So in addition to getting people confirmed and vetting and confirming and all the priorities, you've actually got to put together a document with numbers in it that will be the blueprint for what you do thereafter. Even more important in the current environment, because as we may turn to in a second, in order for them to get anything done, they're going to have to use the special procedures that allow 51 votes, which they do have, and not 60 votes, which they don't have in the Senate, and that involves some intricate budget maneuvers that they have to get right.
One more on the transition. What will happen if the cupboard remains as bare as it seems to be now? What happens on January 20th if the transition does not come along any further?
We have no modern experience with that prospect. So, what happens if offices are literally vacant? What happens if that budget is not actually delivered? What happens if the policy? I have a feeling what's going to happen is and you're already seeing this, a lot more deference to the Hill, where congressional leaders have been working away on plans, on taxes, on healthcare, et cetera, for a long period of time, and they will step into the breach and say, here you go, which solves some of the prioritization issue. It doesn't solve the people question.
In talking about things the administration might do, Donald Trump has been talking more and more about infrastructure. That's something obviously Democrats are in principle in favor of. Everybody likes more money. As a former budget director yourself, how should we think both about the desirability of a big infrastructure program, its likelihood? Just tell us how to think about infrastructure.
Well, I think a few things. First, there is a very strong argument that could be made for a substantial increase in infrastructure investment today. Interest rates, despite the recent run-up, remain quite low. We have a lot of deferred maintenance that could be done today rather than tomorrow when rates are low, and that would make eminent sense. There are a couple complexities or problems, though. One of the problems is there's always the assertion that projects are, quote, shovel-ready. We had this in early 2009. It turns out that, in general, those statements are typically significantly exaggerated, and that it's a it's gnarly to kind of work through getting new projects off the ground. The deferred maintenance, again, is a little bit easier. That's one issue. The second issue is the specific proposal that Mr. Trump has put forward that involves tax credits and what have you and private financing really doesn't work for the vast majority of what we need investments in. The only way you're going to get private money invested, I don't care how much of a tax credit you provide, is if there is a revenue stream on the back end that can repay the upfront money. This is why public-private partnerships in the U.S. are a little bit, they exist, but it's harder to do than it is to say, because you need that revenue stream. And there are lots of things that we should be doing that don't have that revenue stream. Final point. I actually asked Paul Ryan about infrastructure investment about a month ago pre-election, but when he was speaking at the Economic Club of New York. And I mentioned this only because I think you may see more resistance on Capitol Hill than you would have expected. His response was, we just passed the highway bill. I don't know why anyone's talking about new infrastructure investment. So I think this may be one of the examples where the Trump priorities don't coincide exactly with the Hill priorities, and you're likely to see, final point, a bunch of scaling back of the various initiatives that were campaign promises, in part because if you total them all up, you're talking about $10 trillion or more in additional debt over the next decade, and there are a bunch of moderate Republicans that you have to keep in order to get your 51 votes or more than 50 votes in the Senate that may start peeling off with those kinds of numbers, so you're going to have to scale them back anyway.
And is your impression that a lot of Republicans actually care about debt and deficits, or actually care when there's a Democrat in office?
No, but you don't need a lot. You need 3 or 4 or 5 Republicans to care, and then you've got a problem. Because again, if you're trying to get things through on a razor-thin budget reconciliation process, then you can't. This was the problem we had too. Yeah. We had a very thin majority in 2009, and we were trying to get things through that some moderate Democrats didn't like, and you have to compromise. It becomes very challenging. If you don't use that process and you go through the normal process in the Senate and you need Democrats, then it's a completely different discussion.
Let's talk for a moment about the real economy. Hillary Clinton and President Obama are trying to make the case things are getting better too slowly, but they are getting better. Republicans and Donald Trump are making the case things are going to hell, it's terrible. How do you think of the state of the real economy right now and its prospects in the next year under this new administration?
So the real economy is doing okay. It's not fabulous. One big thing that has been missing from most of that discussion is if in your head you had, from the past 30 years that 3.5% growth was good growth, just because the population is aging, you need to subtract about 1.5 points from that.
Oh, interesting.
So what was 3.5 is now 2. So 2 is actually pretty good. It's not gangbusters, just like 3.5 wasn't, but we all have in our head numbers that were based on the growth rate of the workforce that was when the workforce was growing 2 percentage points a year. It's now growing 0.5% a year. And that by itself, even if productivity growth were the same, means the top line number has come down. So is it as strong as it could be? No. Are most Americans still frustrated that their prospects are not improving? Yes. But we also have a little mental adjustment that we need to do.
And that point you're making about adjusting for age, is that it's obvious once you point it out, but I've not seen it pointed out recently.
Yeah, and the problem, here's the broader point. The problem that has arisen, I think, is politicians always like to say, the future will be better, it's a sunnier day, and what have you. That's completely understandable. It's always happened. The difficulty is that as prospects for the median family, the typical family, have lagged behind where the expectations were, the desire to kind of promise that we can return to the heyday, and if people have in their head 3.5%, that's what you're going to, or 4, that's what you're going to be promising, that becomes stronger. So the gap between the rhetoric, the promises, and what the policy world can actually reasonably deliver has grown quite extreme. And so no one really wants to admit, well, maybe the potential growth rate of the economy now is only 2%. It sounds like you're kind of dismal. And I was really struck, we were talking about this briefly before, this interview with the employees at the Carrier air conditioning unit where they had been promised that their jobs would not leave the United States.
Anybody see this interview in the Times over the weekend?
Yeah. So during the campaign, now President-elect Trump had promised that the jobs that this, it's a subsidiary of United Technologies that makes air conditioners, were moving to Mexico, that he would stop that. And so the article was all about the employees saying, well, okay, we voted for you, you promised this, so jobs are staying here, right? And by the way, we won't vote for you if that doesn't happen. In the meanwhile, the Mexican peso has depreciated by about 10%, so it's become even more attractive, by the way, to move jobs to Mexico.
And depreciated because of the election, right?
And depreciated because of the election. But more importantly, there really is no plausible policy intervention that you can apply to a situation like that that will stop those specific jobs from moving if the corporate decision makers have decided that makes more sense. So that's a great example of the rhetoric versus reality. And I think a big question here is what happens when, even if we have an initial sugar rush with a big tax cut and some kick from that, what happens when reality hits that, for example, with regard to those employees, Mr. Trump is not going to be able to save those jobs?
And that is such a great question. I'll ask you that question. So, what do you expect will happen in terms of the promises to people who feel left behind? So part one is what do you think will happen with the Trump plan? Part two is the Orszag plan of what would be the right way for the United States now to deal with these people who are left out.
So I'll answer the first one because the second one's really hard. I mean, but it comes back to, I mean, I'm not minimizing, it comes back to if the goal is we're going to reestablish the way things were, stop the world I want to get off, it becomes an almost impossible chasm to cross. And so there is some desire to try to do that, but I don't want to hold out the false promise that the typical things that I would be talking about will get you all the way there. With regard to what I think is about to happen, I do think there will be a significant change in corporate taxes. I do think that there will be an increased movement towards Medicare Advantage, the private plans as part of Medicare. I do think the Medicaid program, which is currently a split federal-state responsibility, will be turned into a block grant where more of the responsibility and the risk is devolved to the states. I do think there will be something called the Obamacare Repeal Act of 2017, but it's not entirely clear what that will contain, in part because I don't think that you want 17 to 20 million people to lose insurance as one of the first things you do with no replace. And the problem with the repeal and replace rhetoric is the repeal part is moderately clear. The replace part is pretty thin. So we could talk about what might happen on that. But I think those are among the leading things. Now, ask the question, what will that actually do for the typical person? So hard to see how the healthcare changes are going to lead to dramatic changes in the well-being of the typical worker. And the tax cuts are largely, I don't want to say entirely irrelevant, but largely not. If you're in the 15% marginal tax bracket, which is where the typical worker is, this is not doing that much for you.
I have one or two more questions from me, and then I'll involve the audience here. I wanted to extend what you and I were talking about backstage. As you know, I've spent a lot of my time with my wife in the last 3 years in these places that Trump has carried, places with discouraged workers. And what struck me is there is fury in these places at the top level of national government, but within their communities, people feel like they're moving in the right direction. People who are age 30, they never expected to work in the factory, they're starting new jobs, et cetera. How do you, as a policy veteran, think about this split between fury at top-level national government and some sense of engagement and connection at the local level?
For government to be effective, people have to see the benefits. It has to be tangible. And at the state and local level, there's more experimentation, there's more evidence that, oh, this pothole was actually fixed, that's good. And so it's more connected to their lives. The problem is, again, as I was mentioning before, this disconnect between we're going to promise the good old days kind of, and that's sort of been the overarching theme at the federal policy level. No one believes it anymore, or at least doesn't fully believe it. And so that causes a lot of frustration with the federal level, in part because it's so disconnected from what's happening on the ground.
An omnibus last question from me. During his campaign, Donald Trump posited these as enemies of the average person. Mexican immigrants, the Chinese, Wall Street, lobbyists, et cetera. Which of those, if any, do you think he'll be able to make any actual redress of grievances on that would make a difference to anybody?
I don't actually think any of those. I don't anticipate any substantial, frankly, any substantial change on any of them in reality. Again, I think part of what we're experiencing now is there were a ton of statements made on the campaign trail that it may not have been the case that even Mr. Trump fully believed, and that as you try to implement them, they become really, really complicated. So with regard to those 4 at least, I don't really, again, I understand the ease of making a campaign statement, but to actually implement policy becomes really hard really fast.
And Wall Street in particular with the SEC news, et cetera?
Wall Street in particular, again, I mean, the stock market has gone up. Bank stocks in particular have gone up, not down. This is not exactly the populist reaction that one would have expected from the campaign rhetoric.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions. If you raise your hand, yes, up here in the very front row, because I can see you, yes. And could you identify yourself?
Sure, Ellen Sabo. So, ma'am, if you hold for 1 second,
here comes a microphone, please. We're broadcasting this, so yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
The metaphor you gave about the truck, Colin Powell's quote, could one interpret from that if in the Trump transition and the Trump campaign doesn't get the staff hardy and approved and filled, and doesn't jump on it the way you discussed, could one presume or possibly even hope that that means that a lot won't get done on his agenda? I mean, it's a serious question. I mean, could that stall some of the, could that mean there's less hope for some of the things getting passed?
Probably not, because again, on the Hill, they have been working on legislative proposals. I mean, as one example, the repeal part of Obamacare repeal, which would have to be done through budget reconciliation so that you have 51 votes, they already passed that in 2015. They've done it. The legislative language is all there. You may tweak it, but I think instead the result will be that if you're trying to figure out what will likely happen, this comes back a little bit to infrastructure, and there's a divergence between the Trump campaign proposals and the congressional priorities, go with the congressional priorities. One other quick comment on the tractor pull. So that is normally the case because people start turning to the next election. But if you want to get more depressed as a Democrat, you do need to, which is saying something, you do need to realize that the next Senate election is heavily tilted against Democrats. So out of the 33 seats that will be up, it's basically 2/3 that are Democrats and 1/3 that are Republicans. So it's really hard to imagine, even in a midterm election, which typically is more promising for the party out of power, that's going to change. And in the House, I think for the foreseeable future, you've got a Republican House. So there may be another tractor pull coming, I guess.
So one question on this side. Yes, a hand in the middle there. Yes, and wait for a microphone, this gentleman. Yes.
Hello, my name is H.G. Chazelle of Advanced Energy Group. We run energy stakeholder meetings in Washington, D.C., and Chicago. And I'm wondering, you've talked about the promise of things happening that have been put on the campaign trail, but what about maintaining momentum on those things that we feel are promising towards our future, like clean energy policy? What would be your thoughts on how to protect or maintain momentum on those items?
Challenging. I think some of the more promising things, so for example, the fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, getting as much corporate buy-in from the auto manufacturers and the auto community itself that we don't want to go revisit all of this, which I think there's some prospects. I mean, I don't want to say you're there, but kind of that's promising. That will mean, as you're looking at the things that you, as a Trump administration, that you want to kind of take on, there's sort of no point if you're not getting rewarded by the sector that is directly affected. So the more that you can do now to go out to the people who would be pushing for changes in the regulatory environment, the better. Challenging on the coal front because there have been a lot of promises made about, I think basically the power sector regulatory environment is probably the most vulnerable.
Will Trump be able to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord?
I am afraid that even if he doesn't formally pull us out of the Paris Climate Accord, that the effect is similar if we start unwinding a lot of the regulatory apparatus that would make us fulfill the promises that had been made.
On that cheery note, we've reached the end of our time. Please join me in thanking Peter Orszag for what he said. Thank you.